to today's webinar. On behalf of SATTC, we just are so grateful that you took the time this morning to join with us to talk a little bit about the topic of Is Faith Enough? Substance Use and Communities of Faith. My name is James Campbell, and I work as a Training and Technical Assistance Manager for 4 states within the Southeast Addiction Technology Transfer Center. In my case, I work primarily with North and South Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. The session today is being recorded, just so that you know. So we do ask that if you don't mind muting your mics, there will be some times where we'll ask for feedback in the chat and things of that nature, but that would be a big help if you don't mind making sure that you have your mic muted, and so that we don't hear anything that you wouldn't want us to hear. In the world of Zoom, sometimes that occurs as well. Also, you'll notice that in the very top of the chat, there's an evaluation link. That evaluation link will be added again at the end of today's session. We do ask that you give us feedback. It's super short. It's like 10 questions. It takes maybe 2 minutes to do. So if you would, we would greatly appreciate it. That's how we know how we're doing, what you would like more or less of. And also it's part of how we secure our funding through SAMHSA, which allows us to do webinars like this one today. So we really appreciate that. And if you do have questions, please feel free to put those questions in the chat. Ms. Pam Lee, who you may be able to see on your screen, will actually be monitoring that as well. And we'll have some time at the end for questions as we go. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the conversation. First of all, I mentioned earlier that we're part of Southeast Addiction Technology Transfer Center. That's who I work with. And there are actually multiple technology transfer centers. The focus of all of those technology transfer centers, sometimes the word technology throws people. That doesn't mean that we're out there trying to figure out how to do digital things and digital media, or necessarily how to program computers or anything along those lines. In this case, when we say technology, what we mean is what we know by research and evidence works best, what's been demonstrated to work. And we can make that really complicated, but really what I always say is that we try to take evidence-based practices, things that we know from research work, and turn them into practice-based evidence, things that people in the field actually can use and do something with in a practical way. We try to help bridge that gap a bit. And that's where we spend most of our time. I'm a part of the Addiction Technology Transfer Center, but there's also a Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and a Prevention Technology Transfer Center. So we always like to give a nod to them as well, and just let you know that those are a resource that are available to you as well within your given area and your given state. Southeast Addiction Technology Transfer Center is one of 10 regional resource centers related to addiction and recovery across the United States and some of its territories. In our case, we serve 8 states primarily. That's Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, the Carolinas, and Tennessee. And so that gives a little bit of a sense of where we are and where we're coming from. The only other thing I will mention there is that we are housed and located at Morehouse School of Medicine. Our home base is at Morehouse in Atlanta, Georgia. One of the things we always try to do is give you a sense of what our hope is or what our goals are for today. When we think about the objectives or what we would consider success, at the end of the day, if you have more of a sense of how prevalent substance use in the United States is, that will be helpful. That you'll be able to identify 4 criteria of any disease. It will relate it to substance use, but really applies to any diseases that an individual may have. Articulate 2 reasons that choice and willpower alone are not an effective strategy for recovery, and describe 2 ways that faith communities can help support recovery. Now, hopefully we have a lot more than 2 by the end of our time together, but we hope that you're able to at least describe or speak back at least 2 of those, so that they are things that you can really take with you, things that you can really apply in terms of where you work, where you live day to day, and the direction that you're going. Now, one of the things I learned pretty early on with doing presentations, however, is that if I have my list of objectives and I meet all of my objectives, but I do not meet yours, that's not a win. So what I would like to ask you to take a second to do this morning is in the chat, type down what you hope to get out of today, what would be beneficial, what would make it worth your while. Sometimes I word that like this: what would it take at the end of the day if somebody says, hey, you went to that thing this morning? How was it? What would it take for you to be able to say honestly, wow, I'm really glad I went. That was worth going to. Take a moment and type that in the chat if you would. This is also where we usually find out how quickly people type. I'm a slow typer, so it takes me a minute to get those things in there. What would you like to get out of today?
Okay, so far we don't have anyone typing.
Are y'all being shy this morning?
Okay, three practical tips for engaging faith communities in addressing SUD.
Wonderful.
How to support faith communities with the resources they need to help those with substance use disorder. The flow of faith and recovery.
Great suggestions. Excellent. Excellent. If you do have others, please go ahead and put those in.
Say, I really want some additional tools on what faith-based communities, resources, and treatment is available.
Excellent. Excellent. I think our purposes are aligned. I see best practices for helping reduce stigma. That's a wonderful one as well.
Right, to gain a better understanding of how to support individuals in recovery and their families, including their children, in better understanding.
Oh, that's a phenomenal list. You have some great goals today. And so I'm excited by that. Like I said, if you have others, please feel free to continue to put those in. I will keep an eye on those as well and cast my eye over that way. But really, the things that are on my list and the things that are on your list really do overlap quite a bit. And we'll get into some of how those things intersect throughout the course of our conversation today. I do ask that because we're all different people who come from different backgrounds with different beliefs, different ways of seeing the world. I always like to begin with a couple of foundational agreements, things that I like to pose first as questions. How many of you would say that you disagree with somebody in your faith community regarding something you believe? Within your own faith community, how many of you would say, and you can just do this with a reaction, a raise of the hand or a wave, if you would, or the clap. How many of you would say that you disagree with someone in your faith community regarding something you believe? Doesn't mean you disagree on everything, just something. I dare say that that is most of us, for sure. I see that raised hand. Thank you over there. I appreciate that as well. Um, Second question is like the first. How many of you would say that you disagree with someone in your work community or that you work with day by day regarding something that you believe? Once again, the raised hands, yes, for sure. I appreciate that. The reality is that if you have two people, there's going to be disagreement on any subject, and particularly one as personal as faith. And so my hope as we proceed for today is that we'll be able to approach our time together with enough humility to listen and enough compassion to express views with kindness and respect. It doesn't mean that we have to agree on every point of theology or doctrine or belief, but what it does mean is that we're here together because this is something we have a heart for. This is something we hope to grow in and learn more about. And so that's our hope today, is that as we do that, we're able to treat each other with the utmost respect and listen to understand and not just speak to be understood. So part of the reason that we're having this conversation today from the faith community side of things is based on some numbers, but these numbers have people behind them. One of the things I didn't say at the outset is that outside of my work with SATTC, I also serve as a minister. And so these numbers matter to me on a personal level as well. They're things that have an impact in the work that I do there in addition. According to the National Institutes of Health, it's estimated that 1 in 10 individuals will struggle with a non-alcohol substance use disorder at some point in their lifetime, and 1 in 3 will develop an alcohol use disorder at some point in their lives. So, in other words, 1 in 10 at some point are going to struggle with a drug other than alcohol, and 1 in 3 at some point will struggle related to alcohol. That's a pretty important number when you consider it in context, because what that means for people in the faith community is that in a given place of worship, if you have 100 people gathered together, on average, between 30 to 40 will struggle with substance use disorder at some point in their life. In other words, 30 to 40 out of 100, 3 to 4 out of 10 people who are there in your house of worship are going to have an issue around substance use. In other words, not talking about it doesn't insulate us from it. In that regard, it's very important that we acknowledge that this isn't about those people, this is about our people. That those people stigma piece is part of what keeps people who are struggling from being as honest about that. And we'll discuss that a little bit later on as well. Part of the reasoning for that is we've long known that addiction is a disease, and we've read about that in places or seen that wording. My goal today isn't to sway you, to convince you. If you don't believe it's a disease, I'm not trying to twist your arm, but I do think it's really important that you understand when it's referred to as a disease, what is meant. And basically, in disease theory, it's laid out this way. If you have an organ or organ system of the body and it functions well, you have good things happen. That's health. On the other hand, if you have an organ or organ system of the body and it functions otherwise, you have symptoms, you have distress. Bad things happen in many cases. So in the case of health, if you have a heart that's beating regularly, is pumping blood as it should, that's a win, that's a good thing. But if you have an organ system, say the heart, that isn't functioning as it should be, that's going to cause some symptoms, some distress, some problems, some disease that needs some form of treatment or intervention in order to really make a difference with it. Now, one thing that's really an important consideration is that people, for whatever reason, if the organ system of the body that is impacted is something like the heart or the lungs, then they tend to be really compassionate. If you say to someone, my father had a heart attack, they will say things like, because I'm in the Southeast, they'll say, bless your heart. They may sign you up or put him on a prayer chain for prayer. And they may even bring a casserole to your house. It may well be filled with butter and salt and cheese and not necessarily good for his heart. But the reality is there tends to be a very compassionate response when the organ system impacted is the lungs or the kidneys or the heart, something of that nature. For whatever reason, however, when the organ system that is impacted is the central nervous system or the brain, people respond typically very differently to that. If I say to someone, my father attempted to commit suicide, they might say, bless your heart. They're probably not putting that on a prayer chain. And I can almost bet that we won't be getting a casserole in that scenario. Again, it's an organ system of the body, and it's prone to things that go awry, just like any other can be. Or if I say to someone, my son had an overdose, people are not always as compassionate. Now, sometimes they just don't know how to be. They're uncomfortable talking about addiction or don't feel competent or confident in their ability to discuss it. They get a little anxious. And so, my hope is that part of what we can support is our congregations being as compassionate about mental health and addiction issues as they are about any other health issue. One of the things I love about the faith community is that it is full of people who are largely very compassionate, loving, and empathetic people. People who have a heart for seeing others heal, grow stronger, get better. All of those things tend to be in play. And so, for that reason, part of our conversation today is really directed toward that. How do we show support toward individuals who may be struggling with substance use or a substance use disorder? Also, if you're going to talk about addiction being a disease at all, they don't let us make up what's considered a disease. Sadly, they won't let me make that up. So in this case, we look to the American Medical Association, AMA, and they say for anything to be considered a disease, there's certain criteria it has to meet. Number one, it has to have a cause. Now, we may or may not know initially what that is. We may just know people are getting sick, but we may not know why. For instance, in the early days of Ebola or the early days of HIV, we didn't really know what was causing it. Like there were all kinds of wild theories about where those diseases came from. In the case of addiction, you usually hear two primary ideas about the cause. You kind of have your nature people and you have your nurture people. Your nature people are people who talk about it being a genetic thing, that it runs in families, that there's a genetic predisposition, is the word you'll usually hear used. Now, it is important to point out that that is not genetic predestination. In other words, just because it runs in your family does not mean that you have to get it, that you have to struggle with it. Um, but you are more likely, you're at greater risk if there's a family member who has struggled with that previously. Um, the other camp tends to be the nurture side of the equation. And the nurture side of the equation is more social learning kind of folks. They say things like, no, it's all about your upbringing. It's how you were raised, it's how you were brought up, it's what you saw modeled in the household. If every time I saw my mother get stressed out, she drank a 12 pack. Well, when I grow up and I get stressed out, I've had modeled for me that that's how you deal with stress. So those two things, or those two camps, tend to have a little bit of tension between them. I actually started out far over on the nurture side of the equation. The nature people who talked about genetics in the early days for me honestly annoyed me, and I debated with them frequently. The problem is that while I was debating, I was reading a lot of research, and it really, really annoys me when research contradicts what I want to believe. Sometimes, you just want to believe what you believe. You don't want to have that challenge. Uh, but I read a lot of great research that really pointed to the fact that there really is a strong genetic component. The most important research I ever came across was an Oxford study of identical twins over the course of 50 years that were adopted at birth. So these individuals never lived with their biological mother or father any. And what they found is in the case of individuals who were born to parents who struggled with a substance use disorder or addiction, that they were 4 times more likely than the average person in the population to struggle with addiction, even if they never lived with them a single day of their life. Man, that just messed my nurture train all up. But the reality is, it's neither nature nor nurture that causes addiction. The cause of addiction, the number one cause of addiction, is dose and frequency. How much someone uses, how often. In other words, even if there's no genetic history, nobody in your family tree has ever struggled with addiction. The reality is that if someone uses enough of a substance long enough, they can develop it. They can end up with a substance use disorder. On the flip side, even if you have that family history, if you never use a substance, you're not going to be addicted to that substance. You've never met a person who was addicted to cocaine who did not first use cocaine, or who was addicted to alcohol who did not first drink alcohol. In that regards, it's kind of like all the wiring of the house is set, but the chemical hasn't been put in place to throw the switch that turns on the electricity, if you will. So the cause of addiction in our scenario is use, dose, and frequency. Also, if something's going to be considered a disease, it has to have symptoms. Uh, what what are the ways that you know you have it? What are the things that you look for? In the case of addiction, what's often thrown out there as symptoms are actually not. Often, when you ask somebody about symptoms of addiction, you get things like, homeless, depressed, living under a bridge, gathered around a fire barrel, sores, poor oral hygiene, unkempt, not taking care of themselves, criminal. You get a lot of those things thrown out there. And the reality is that those are not symptoms of addiction, those are stereotypes of addiction. those stereotypes actually keep a lot of people who could benefit from being a part of a recovery community or going through treatment out of getting the help that they need because they think, well, that's not me. That doesn't apply. I'm not living under a bridge. Now, are there people with addictions who meet that stereotype? Yes, but those are a tiny minority of those who struggle with a substance use disorder, a really small portion of the population. The actual symptoms of substance use disorder are things like tolerance. Did it ever get to where you could use more uh, and not feel the effects, or it took more in order to feel the effect? Did you ever have withdrawal? And you can say a lot about withdrawal, but probably the quickest way to explain it is whatever a substance does going into your system, it does the opposite coming out. In other words, if you're on cocaine or on methamphetamine and you're up for days, what happens when it runs out or when you come off of it? You crash. You're tired. You want to sleep. Likewise, in the case of, say, alcohol, that's a central nervous system depressant. It slows everything down. So if someone's been drinking heavily for a long time and then they stop using, what happens is the opposite. In fact, they may even get to the point where their hands shake because their central nervous system is so overstimulated in that moment. So withdrawal is another symptom. Using more than intended. That can be something as basic as they bought a 12 pack of beer and they thought that would last them the weekend and it didn't make it through Friday night. Those kinds of things, or use longer than intended. I'll be back from the bar, I'll be back from my friend's house by midnight, and they come back in at 11 the next morning. Uh, all of those kinds of things are symptoms of substance use disorder. The problem is that stereotypes are really easy to spot. You can see the person tapping on your window at the gas station. Symptoms are much harder to spot. You have to be really close to someone, or they have to be willing to be honest with you in order to know if someone's really having those symptoms. Did they ever give up something that mattered to them related to the substance? Well, unless you know what matters to them or they tell you, you're not necessarily going to know that. That's an important distinction because the symptoms are things that many people may even brag about. Oh, they can't hold their liquor, that kind of a thing. When in reality, that's a warning sign. If someone is able to, quote, hold their liquor, that actually puts them at greater risk. Third in that list of things that are required for something to be considered a disease is prognosis. In other words, what happens untreated? What happens if someone doesn't stop the progression of the illness? In the case of addiction, the prognosis ultimately, unless they enter into recovery, unless they stop the progression of the addiction, is death. Now, you may have heard that put in different ways. Sometimes you'll hear institutions and facilities, things of that nature. Uh, the reason I don't even include those in the list is because I know people who go into institutions and yet still continue to use. Just because someone goes to jail doesn't necessarily mean their use stops. And so if that isn't treated, if that person doesn't stop using in some form or fashion, the prognosis for substance use disorders is pretty grim if allowed to proceed. Uh, and a disease may or may not have treatment. Uh, Now, I do want to take a step back here and say that when I say treatment for substance use disorders, I am not talking only about formal treatment. Some people go to a treatment center, they may go to a medical detox, they may go to a residential program, but here that's really not what I'm speaking of. When I say a treatment for addiction, I mean anything that helps stop the progression of the illness, that stops the progression of the use. So that could be a formal treatment, like what I just mentioned, but it could also be going to a 12-step program. They might go to AA or NA or CA, like Cocaine Anonymous. They may go to Rational Recovery or Smart Recovery or Celebrate Recovery. There are lots of mutual aid models out there and mutual aid supports that also can be an informal means of treatment for recovery from substance use disorder. We really are looking here for anything that is a pro-social, positive thing in the person's life that can support movement toward greater health and movement away from the active use. That's what we really mean in the case of treatment there. And finally, a disease may be acute or chronic. Acute just means that you can get rid of it. In other words, if you break a bone and you go to the doctor, they set the bone, and hopefully they put the cast on, or they get everything fixed. And then shortly after, you get the cast off and things are fixed, things are better. Or you get a cut and you have to go and get stitches. And they stitch it up. And once the stitches are gone, you're more or less healed. You have a sinus infection and you go and get, depending on where you go, an antibiotic. And if it helps you get over your sinus infection, it's curable. In the case of a chronic illness, uh, those are things that usually are slower onset. They don't come on quickly. That's like heart disease, diabetes, asthma in some cases, things of that nature. In the case of a chronic disease or a chronic illness, these are things that you have to manage throughout the course of your lifetime. If someone has, adult onset diabetes, um, that's something they're going to have to monitor. They're going to keep up with their blood sugars. They're going to need to try to maintain a healthy weight and some activity, things of that nature. Uh, One of the things that is a struggle in terms of addiction, and faith communities can have a huge role in impacting, is that the treatment model as it exists, primarily in the United States, for addiction is an acute model. But we also know that addiction is a chronic disease. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't get better from it. They absolutely do. Treatment works. People do recover, absolutely. But what I'm saying is that just as with diabetes, you may be doing well for a long period of time, and then your blood sugars get out of whack. Things spike up. You may need to go back in, get stabilized, things of that nature. Likewise, in the case of addiction, someone may have a relapse or a recurrence of use. And if that happens, they may need additional support for a time, or they may not. They may just need additional support by way of a sponsor or a peer or somebody they're able to talk to. All of those things can really work together. However, one thing is that since we have an acute treatment model and a chronic disease, there is a massive gap, meaning there are tons of people who need support for their recovery that the treatment system in the United States is utterly inequipped to handle. That means that we need collaboration and communication with the recovery community. We need collaboration and communication with faith communities, because there are some people who will go to NA who may never grace the doors of a faith community. And there are many people who will go through the doors of a faith community who are never going to grace the doors of one of the 12-step fellowships. It's not an either or, and some will happily go to both. The key is that we really need that continuum of support if we're really going to make a difference in terms of helping people who are struggling. One of the things that most of the major world religions have in common is that we really are seeking to have compassion and care for others. We're trying to help people to heal. We're trying to help people to become who they're designed to be. That's a major part of nearly every faith. This is a huge opportunity to be a part of that through recovery. When I say recovery, what do I mean? Well, again, that can be really complicated. My goal is not to make anything complicated. Let's keep it as simple as we can. Recovery is the process of recovering or getting back whatever somebody lost because of their substance use. In the case of substance use, that could mean that they lost their driver's license. It could mean they lost their job. It could mean they lost their children. It could mean they lost their self-respect. It could mean that they just lost money. So whatever that person lost that they're trying to recover is part of their recovery. And I can't define what someone's recovery is about. Their recovery is a very personal journey. There's what is it that they are trying to get back or to claim back following a period of use. So that's how addiction falls in and meets those criteria for a disease. That's why it's referred to as a disease and why we speak about it as a disease. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a framework for that conversation. But again, if you go back to our analogy earlier of my father had a heart attack. Again, if you think of faith communities, that is usually received with compassion. That is usually met with support. If someone does have an overdose or they have an immediate family member who's struggling with addiction and they don't receive that same kind of compassionate response, why would we anticipate that they would stay? Why would we anticipate that they would necessarily stay connected? So, in that regard, what we're looking for is someone just to show the same kind of compassion that they would show anybody who's a part of their faith community, that they're really coming alongside and being a support in that regard. So, what about choice and willpower? You often hear people say, they just have a lack of self control, they have a lack of willpower. They just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. You often hear those kinds of things thrown away. It's a choice. You can choose to use and you can choose not to use. What I would submit to you, and this is a fine distinction, but I think it'll make sense. Choice is not a part of addiction, but choice is a part of recovery. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a moment. Choice is not a part of addiction. It doesn't mean that choices didn't lead to the addiction. So if someone, again, chose to use for a prolonged period, that can oftentimes lead to an addiction for sure. But the reality is that if you just line people up and go, "Would you like an addiction?" Nobody's probably signing up. Yes, I'll take heroin, please. Or no, why don't you give me OxyContin? Or hey, why don't you give me Xanax? You're not usually going to see people sign on in that way. There are decisions that may lead to that, and sometimes it's not even decisions that will lead to that physiological dependence. If someone has surgery, for instance, or things of that nature, that can come into play. But I do want to take a moment to talk about why choice and willpower is not a real good plan in and of itself, by itself, in terms of recovery. Uh, Part of that is found in how the brain works. Now, if you've been in other trainings with me, I go into a lot of detail on the neuroscience. I like that. This isn't that sort of training, so I'm not going to get lost in those weeds. I just want to give enough information so that we can kind of get a basic understanding of why just saying, well, just quit using doesn't really work. And oftentimes you'll hear family members say that, why don't they just quit? Well, here's part of the answer to that. Your brain's job is to keep you alive. Everything that your brain does is geared toward your survival and to the survival of others, the survival of the species, if you will. Uh, we can make this a lot more complicated, but really it does that by two primary systems of the brain. One is that the colorful part in the middle is called the midbrain or the limbic system. It's the gas pedal of the brain. It is the part that gets us up off the couch and doing things. For instance, if you are hungry, it is your limbic system that tells you that. If you are thirsty, it is your limbic system that tells you that. If you have a desire to connect with other human beings, it is your limbic system that tells you that. Those things that are important to getting up, to doing, to moving, and surviving come from that system of the brain. I call it the gas pedal of the brain for that reason. It gets us up, gets us moving, gets us doing things. The other system of the brain is found up toward the front. It's called the prefrontal cortex or neocortex. It's your brakes and your steering. It's the decider, to borrow an old phrase from a former president. Uh, so again, if you have this gas pedal is well and good and helps us to survive, but if you have only a gas pedal that you can't steer, that's probably not going to go very well for you. Uh, so basically, that prefrontal cortex, that neocortex, decides what are we going to do with that urge. In other words, the limbic system may say, "I want chocolate cake." Uh, the prefrontal cortex goes, "Your blood sugar's high. You might want to hold off on the chocolate cake." It helps us to decide and to navigate those things. Part of the problem with that is that when you think of someone being self-disciplined or having self-control, you're really talking about them using this prefrontal cortex, they're using that decision-making part of the brain. Now, I want to give you a scenario for a moment that illustrates one of the reasons this is problematic when it comes to substance use. If you were to go and walk by a lake or a river or down by the ocean, I should warn you, this is not a very trauma-informed approach, but this is a chance for those with a forensic mind to shine. If you watch NCIS and First 48 Hours and Law and Order, this is a chance for you to really shine. If you're walking down by the water and you see, lo and behold, a body that is face down in the water, it's not like a let me pull them out, do CPR body. It's been there clearly for a little bit. And so you call 911 or emergency services. They send someone out. They pull the body out of the water, and they see that there's a large lump on the side of their head, like a big place where clearly there has been a blow. They're trying to decide forensically, was this person hit in the head and killed and the body just dumped in the water? Or was this person maybe slipped and bumped their head and fell in and drowned? So if that's the case, how did they determine whether or not the person was alive when they went into the water? How did they determine that? They determined that by doing an autopsy. And in that autopsy, they're looking to see if there's water in the lungs. Now, I won't do this by way of a poll, but I do want to ask you, how many of you think that you can breathe water consistently? That you can breathe water? You can breathe it in once. Hopefully none. We don't breathe water well. We're designed for air. Since that is the case, and since everybody knows this, why would anyone who ever drowned in the history of the world have water in their lungs? It doesn't make any sense. We know we can't breathe it. The problem is that when survival is on the line, when survival is at play, the limbic system, that gas pedal, will override that prefrontal cortex. It will overpower it. And people will do things that they swore that they would never do. They swore to their spouse, to their mom, to their dad, to their kids, to their probation officer, to their social worker. I'm done, I'm through. And when they said it, they meant it. The problem is when those dopamine levels get down so low, that craving is so powerful. When that happens, their brain interprets that as I am dying. And in that moment, their response, unless they have some really good support around them, is not going to go very well. In a sense, what a fellowship or AANA meeting is doing, a sponsor is doing, a good clinician is doing, in some cases, a good peer support specialist is doing in some cases, is they're helping to support the prefrontal cortex of that person until theirs comes back online in many ways, particularly in early recovery. I also noticed over in the chat that someone said a test for willpower. I'll give you an X-lax and use your willpower not to go to the bathroom. That's not a completely bad analogy. Willpower in and of itself doesn't work. And why is that? Because sometimes your willpower takes a day off. How many of you have ever been on a diet? How many of you have ever been on more than one? Well, why would you ever need to go on more than one? Well, because willpower is inconsistent. Now, I also want to take a moment to footnote here, though, that willpower is important and choice is important. Remember I said earlier that choice is not a part of addiction, but it is a part of recovery. There is nobody who's maintained their sobriety or maintained their recovery for a prolonged period without willpower. It's just that willpower alone is insufficient. It is not strong enough to maintain someone's recovery. They need supports around them related to that as well. Here I have two more brain slides, and then we're going to leave the brain stuff alone and move on. But I want to illustrate a little bit further why willpower and decision-making, just making a choice, is a problem. In the case of someone who is actively using, here we're only going to talk about three parts of the brain. One of them we already talked about. The prefrontal cortex is up top in this analogy or in this scan. It's your decision-making part. Your temporal lobes are over here on the sides, and it's where memory is stored. It's where people's history is stored. Things they've experienced, things that they've done, things that they know is primarily stored over here as facts. And this part back in the very back, down at the bottom, is the occipital lobe, and it's what pays attention to what visual cues we pay attention to. Now, the brain on the left is what they call a naive brain, somebody who didn't ever use substances. They were not high, hadn't used any drugs. And what you can see in this case is that the red area is actually a lot of brain activity happening. That's where there's heavy brain activity. On the right is a person who is actively using cocaine in this instance. So I want you to look at the difference in how much prefrontal cortex up top activity is happening. So we say make a good choice, but someone who's already actively using, their capacity to make a good choice is really inhibited. It's not a matter of their desire, their ability to make a good decision is impaired. How about the temporal lobes where their memory is stored? Because we often say things to people like, play the tape through, remember where this got you last time, things of that nature. Again, if you consider the brain on the left versus the brain on the right, what is their ability when they are already using to play the tape through? While they're actively using, their ability to do that is greatly impaired. And then last, down at the bottom, that occipital lobe, what do they pay attention to visually? In other words, if they're struggling with cocaine and they open their wallet and in there is their faith leader's number or their sponsor's number and a $20 bill. Again, their capacity, if they're already under the influence on the right, is greatly diminished to pay attention to the right cues. So visually, they're having a harder time finding the support. They're not being as easily able to remember what happened last time, consequences, and their ability to decide is impaired for someone who's already using. Now, we're using the example of cocaine, but this is really similar for any substance of misuse. This is really the same. Now, let's take a look, though. What about somebody who isn't currently using, who is currently not under the influence? What this is the same brain on that top row at an hour, at 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and an hour. The hour is all the way over on the right. The top brain is a naive brain. And what they did in this situation is they're just showing them images of different things. It might be a tree, a flower, a person walking, a train, a line of cocaine. And so they're just like interjecting random things in there. So in the case of the person on the top, as they show that person those images over time, initially the brain activity is pretty high. And what you really see from left to right is that person getting bored on that top line. Okay, they're still able to make decisions cognitively. They're thinking pretty clearly, but now they're not really trying to recall that and attach it to memory or anything like that. In that middle row, you see the word cocaine abuser. Now, first of all, abuser is not a word that we would recommend using at all, and there's some really good research around that that I could go into another time. For the purposes of the day, though, that is what was used in the study, and that's why it's what's included on this slide. For a person who has used cocaine regularly but has not used for 2 weeks, doing the same study, look at what their ability is and what their brain activity is when faced with those kind of prompts, those kind of cues. Again, they're seeing tree, flower, chirping bird, line of cocaine, or a crack rock, or a chalet or pipe, or something like that. When they're seeing those things laid out, their ability to really make good decisions, play the tape through, and pay attention to those visual cues is still really impaired even after 2 weeks of not using. Well, that's pretty early in recovery. We can agree 2 weeks is pretty early. So let's move to 4 months of abstinence, 4 months of not using in this study. And again, if you look at it, you begin to see some red areas coming back. You begin to see brain activity picking back up. What you see, though, is that the longer that person is exposed to those images, so again, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, the less that brain activity is there. It becomes less pronounced. Now, there are a couple of takeaways from this. Number one is most treatment programs only last 3 or 4 months. What that means is that the point that they're sending people out the door and saying, congratulations on finishing services, their brains are really just beginning to heal well in many cases. And so, in that regard, the faith community has a huge opportunity to step in as a support for people in their recovery here. This is a place that they can be of tremendous benefit. takeaway number two from this, it's important for people to know that uh, staying in the presence of a trigger is a bad idea. Again, even at 4 months of abstinence in the case of this study, the longer that person stays exposed to those triggers, the higher the likelihood their thought processes are going to not be working well. They're going to be impaired. The third thing that I think is incredibly important from this, and I don't want to miss this, is that if you look at the second row versus the bottom row, what you are seeing is physiological proof, evidence that recovery happens. The brain is literally healing. You're seeing more activity come back online. Now, what we know for someone who's been using substances for a long period of time, for most people, those neurotransmitters begin to come back online at about 30 days ish. Um, in the fellowships, they've often said 90 meetings in 90 days. They kind of intuitively knew some stuff. It took a while for science to catch up with. It takes about 90 days, 3 to 4 months for those neurotransmitters to begin to heal. And for most substances to fully come back to a baseline, a good functioning level, for most folks is about a year. Again, if you know that formal treatment's only lasting 3 to 4 months, and recovery, just in terms of a physiological brain standpoint, is taking at least about a year, that's a huge gap. Again, an opportunity for faith communities to be involved. I will put one disclaimer here too. In the case of methamphetamine, that recovery rate is actually closer to 2 years for the brain to fully heal. It's nuanced in that it does a great deal of damage through both increasing dopamine output and keeping it down in the synapse. It does some significant damage. It takes some time to heal from. People can and do recover from methamphetamine. Absolutely. It is, however, a longer process physiologically. So, in the face of that, let me tell you some things that are not particularly helpful. It doesn't mean that these aren't things that maybe have some degree of utility. It's not that they're a bad idea. It's just that if someone is in the middle of a craving, it's probably not going to be the most beneficial to them. Pray more. Sometimes we'll hear people say, well, you just need to pray more. If you think that someone struggling with a substance use disorder has not prayed, you are probably deceiving yourself. Um, Oftentimes they've begged for this to be taken away from them. They've begged to no longer desire it. They're begged for the strength to not use one more day. They have oftentimes prayed more than most people in the faith communities are, if I want to get really honest with it. They pray many times, but prayer in and of itself is not a sufficient way of addressing an addiction in and of itself. Now, I don't want to discredit that. One of the things we know is that belief really does make a difference. Prayer really can make a difference. I'm not negating that. What I'm saying is that if prayer is your recovery plan, you need a much stronger recovery plan. And likewise, to just say to someone who's struggling, well, you need to pray more, is really uncompassionate. If you said to somebody again who was in the middle of a heart attack, clearly you need to pray more. That would be, almost medical negligence. You know what I mean? You wouldn't do that. Or you would be praying for them while you called EMS. Likewise, when someone's struggling with an addiction, praying for them is good. That's a wonderful thing. But be doing that while you're coming alongside. Be doing that while we're taking steps to connect them to resources, while we're trying to help them to recover. Likewise, saying read more, although that may sound like a really good idea and it's not bad advice in and of itself, it is not very effective in terms of managing an addiction. The reality is oftentimes we try to out-educate addiction, and the reality is that addiction isn't an educational issue. In fact, most of the time, people who've been using substances for a long time could teach us a whole lot about drugs and teach us a whole lot about recovery. It's not an intellectual problem any more than I say to you, hey, not eating healthy foods makes us more likely to struggle with diabetes and high blood pressure. But we in the Southeast still we love our sweets and our sweet tea, and we like to deep fry everything. It's not an intellectual problem. We know this isn't very healthy, and yet we do it anyway. You can't out educate an addiction. Now, some information may be really helpful, but that's not going to be an adequate response to someone who's struggling. Likewise, saying to someone, try more or do more. We need you to do more and try harder. That again is not going to be very helpful. Number one, it negates the fact that they may have been white knuckling it and struggling and holding on for all their worth for a long time. They're often worn out and on the verge of defeat. And if you come along and go, well, you just need to try, that negates all the struggling they've been doing. And if anything, they're like, wow, I've been doing all this time, and they just think I'm not even trying. I may as well just give up. It can be a huge discouragement to people to say those sorts of things. So again, it's not that there isn't some value, some validity, some utility in some of those things, but if this is our whole playbook for how to support somebody in their recovery, it is not a very good playbook. It's not going to be very effective in helping those who are truly struggling with a substance use disorder to heal and to get better. So, what can faith communities do? How can faith communities really help? Uh, Number one, talk about it. Now, that sounds really basic, but I know I've been around faith communities most of my life, and one of the things I hear is, well, if we talk about it, they might want to try it. I hear that said about all kinds of things. Uh, People are managing to find their way to it, whether you talk about it or not. Oftentimes, and this is me putting on my minister hat for a second, one of the challenges in faith communities is sometimes we spend an inordinate amount of time answering questions that no one's even asking, rather than talking about where people are actually struggling and what are the areas that they really are having a difficult time. To illustrate that, this research actually came from Lifeway Research, so it is predominantly Christian, and so I put that out by way of consideration. Uh, the question they asked was, how often do pastors speak in the church about sermons or large group messages about mental illness? So in this case, they were talking about mental illness. And what they found is 2 out of 3 is once a year or less, maybe down to never. So 2/3 are not mentioning it any more than once a year, if at all. That's a massive number that just aren't addressing mental health, that aren't addressing substance use disorders in their faith communities. Compare that to the charts on the right. Among family members of a person with a mental illness, 65%, again, 2/3 want the person, want the pastor, want the rabbi, want the imam talking about it. Wow, 2/3 want it and 2/3 aren't doing it. That's what we call a gap. That's a missed opportunity to step in and speak some wisdom and speak some encouragement and support within faith communities. Among those who struggle with a mental illness, 60%, so again, just under 2/3, again, want this to be something that's discussed. They want this to be something that's talked about. So basically, to use an analogy from my own faith, the sheep are hungry, and the shepherds aren't always feeding them. That's a concern, and that's an issue. The last thing I want to say on this that I do think is important to note is that there are more people who are family members who want this talked about than they are who are using. The reason that's important to point out, and you probably already know this anecdotally, is that oftentimes if you are a leader in a faith community, it is at least as likely and probably more likely that it's a family member coming to you about the issue than it is the person actively using at the time. Very often it's someone coming to you going, can you talk to my husband? Can you talk to my son? Can you talk to my daughter, my niece, my nephew, my uncle, my mom, my dad? They're struggling with this thing or they're going through this thing. Oftentimes it's the family member that reaches out first. I think that's somewhat because of stigma and shame. The individual who's actively struggling uh, may see themselves as less than, or be concerned that others in the faith community will see them as less than. But the issue is that if we're not talking about it within the faith community, we don't know what people are viewing it as, or we don't know whether or not it's a supportive environment for someone to recover or not. So talking and having that conversation is a wonderful first step. That's an important thing. Someone put in the chat, most pastors can't talk about what they don't know. They need to bring a professional in, um, but they're not aware of the concerns or they're just limited. I do think that is a very good point. One of the things that we're seeking to do through some of these faith initiatives is, number one, just elevate knowledge among faith leaders about substance use disorder. We're not asking that everyone become an expert in addictions or an expert in mental health diagnoses or anything else. What we are asking is that they be willing to use the influence that they have to serve everybody who's a part of their faith community. Again, that 30 to 40 out of 100 who we know are going to struggle with a substance use disorder. If I'm struggling with something and I know that there is, or I'm not aware of any help or support for me within a faith community, then I'm probably going to go seek that support somewhere else. So sometimes that may even be an issue of whether someone stays connected to that faith community as well. Those are all good considerations. And bringing in someone to talk is not a bad thing either. Maybe having someone come in and talk to your congregation or talk to your faith community about an issue, or somebody who's in recovery just come and tell their story. Again, that doesn't have to be the whole service or anything, but that can be a time or an opportunity to really engage people and help them know, hey, when I was struggling, this is what I saw from the faith community, or this is the support that I did get from the faith community, because sometimes it's very positive as well. So having that conversation is incredibly important. 2, referring when appropriate and sharing resources. Now, resources can be anything from having pamphlets available, having an 800 number for AA or NA available, having Celebrate Recovery on site. I mean, that could be all kinds of different approaches and ways of doing things, or NA or AA on site. It can be a lot of different things. It could be even up to the point of being a provider, and we'll get into that, excuse me, in a bit as well. We want to share resources and refer when appropriate. First, I want us to turn our attention to the right side of this graph. We'll get to that left in a minute. When again, pastors were asked whether their church maintain a list of local mental health resources for church members, 2/3 said yes. 2/3 said yes, we keep those resources on hand, we have them. However, when they asked families within those same groups, hey, are you aware of any resources for mentally ill that exist in your church? 2/3 said, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't have that here. So 2/3 of pastors say we've got it, and 2/3 of people in the pews, so to speak, people part of that faith community, says we don't know about it. That is what we call a glaring lack of communication. To have a resource and to not know you have it is to not have a resource. So in that regards, we need to, if we do have those resources, make them available, make them known, let people know what they are. And if we don't have those resources, that's a really good cue for that other third that maybe that's something that you ought to develop, that you ought to put together to consider as well. Well, why would you want to pull together resources around mental health or around substance use? Why would we want to do that? Well, part of that is the left side of this graph. Among pastors, they ask the question, do you agree or disagree with this? I am reluctant to get involved with those with acute mental illness because it takes too much time and resources. 74% said, no, I don't think that. I think that number is gracious and high. 22% were honest and said, yeah, I can't really get involved. Like, I don't have enough hours in the day. If someone's in crisis, I can't step in and deal with every crisis. What I want us to understand is 2 things. Number one is most faith leaders have little to no training in counseling. It's not what they primarily train for, unless that really was their specialty. So to think that they necessarily have any expertise in stepping in and helping during a crisis situation is really an unreasonable expectation on that individual. And I've seen many people in the faith community wear themselves out and burn themselves out trying to be that when it's not their gifting, it's not their knowledge base, it's not their skill set, and it's not anything they have training for, and trying to meet a need. For those who legitimately maybe even have the skill but don't have the time, or else they don't have that skill set, making a referral is just a responsible thing to do. Again, if we're at in my faith community having services and someone falls down with a heart attack, I can't fix that. I don't have the expertise. I may know enough CPR to help them survive till real help arrives. And that's not a bad analogy. In many ways, what often needs to happen in that case, when someone's really struggling with a crisis of mental health, a crisis related to their addiction, an overdose, or an issue in their life that brings that to the fore, it doesn't mean that I have to be able to fix it. What it may mean is I need to do some CPR, some spiritual first aid, uh, to help them survive long enough to get to the support and the help that they need. Referral is a good thing. I wouldn't try to treat the heart attack in the middle of a sanctuary or in the middle of a mosque or a temple or synagogue, uh, but that may be where the need first arises. So likewise with addiction or with a mental health crisis, when it arises, we need to know how to make referrals, how to connect people to those things that are really going to be a benefit to them as well. So we talk about it. We refer when appropriate. We share resources. Um, One thing I didn't put here, but I do want to mention, is be aware of your own influence and your own scope of practice. And what I mean by that is I'm not a medical doctor. I work for Morehouse School of Medicine, but I'm not a medical doctor. What that means is that I'm not going to try to tell somebody what they need to do with their medications. I have expertise of one type, but I don't have expertise of the other. And I have to be really mindful and careful, because sometimes people assume I know things that I don't, and they'll ask me questions. In my role as minister, I see that same thing happen as well. People assume I know a lot more about some things than I do, and they come and they ask me. Well, if they come and ask me about what their glucophage level should be for their diabetes, or what their lisinopril level should be for their high blood pressure, I'm not going to speak into that. I have no knowledge. I don't have good wisdom on that, good information. It's not my expertise. So why would I think that if they're on methadone, or if they're on buprenorphine, or if they're considering going into a detox, or if they're considering something like that, unless I have that expertise, why would I try to speak into that? It's not being very responsible as a faith leader. It's stepping outside of my realm of knowledge, outside of the scope of what I know. In that regard, I can do pastoral counseling or faith-based counseling or spiritual counseling and be a support to them. But I'm not going to be able to really meet that need completely, because it's beyond my scope. Another reason that we're here today is that we know that statistically, only 1 in 10 people who could benefit from some form of treatment ever engage in it. What that means is that 9 out of 10, 90% of people who struggle with substance use and with substance use disorders never get the help they could benefit from or need. One of the roles that the faith community can have is helping to connect people who are struggling with resources that already exist. Or it may at times raise the awareness that there's some new resources needed in a community. But unless faith leaders in the faith community are engaged in that conversation, when people come and they say, I'm struggling, they're helping to connect them to those supports. People are falling down off the cliff instead of going across a bridge that the faith community can be a part of helping to build, and really trying to help collaborate and acknowledge and build those services. We want to exist in part to see people grow healthy, to grow spiritually, but also to grow healthy physically, to grow well psychologically, to grow well and socially, and in every regard. This is a part of that calling and part of that ministry for many faith communities, is how do we really help the whole person to heal and to grow in their faith? This is a part of that as well. And so to do that, we really need to focus on equipping our community, equipping our faith community. Some of those we already talked about, talking about it, having resources, beginning to pull those together, being compassionate is a good one. Really being sympathetic to listening, not just giving short answers and short phrases or quotes. When they're not ready yet, that's not a very compassionate response. They hadn't hit bottom yet. When they get sick and tired of being sick and tired, all those things that you hear thrown out, those things may sound like they have a grain of wisdom in it. And in terms of setting boundaries, sometimes it may, truthfully. But what I can also say is that that same idea is part of why 9 out of 10 people never get the help and support that they need or could benefit from. We have to come at it from a place of compassion as people of faith to really make a difference. Using respectful language is a part of that. In other words, you don't want to use language that in any way dehumanizes somebody. Historically, if you ever wanted to treat someone as less than, you referred to them by a label rather than as a human being. That's true in matters of race. That's true in matters of sexual orientation. That's true in matters of a great many things. If you want to dehumanize someone or treat them as less than, you throw a label on them instead of treating them as a human being. In that regard, instead of saying, oh, that's that old quote, crackhead, pothead, weed head, pill head, addict, whatever you want to say, that's really not the most respectful language to use. Uh, Really, the best language I've ever found to use for engaging people, because in theory, at least in my belief system, we're trying to be there to be compassionate to all people. And so treating them with respect is part of that. The best way to refer to people is as people. It is a person with an addiction. It is a person with a mental health disorder. It is a person who is going through a struggle. It's not that addict or those people. It's a person who I have care and compassion for. So using respectful language in that way is a part of that. Being more aware of substance use issues within your own faith community, being more aware of what resources exist in your community for those who are struggling with substance use. Whether, again, those are informal, like mutual aid, that would be like your AA, NA, Celebrate Recovery, etc., Rational Recovery, Smart Recovery, or things like Faces and Voices of Recovery, which focuses on advocacy and really people telling their own story who are willing to do so. That becomes a part of that, being more aware of what resources are there and being more informed about those resources. In other words, it's great that I know there's a treatment center down the road, but do I know what they do? Do I know who's an appropriate referral to them? Do I know if they require payment up front? Do they accept insurance? Is it free? Uh, is it only geared toward people of a particular faith? Those are things that are important to know so that we can make a good referral. If you ask me, if you came to my hometown and you asked me, where should we eat tonight? And I say, well, there's this restaurant on the corner. That doesn't tell me if that restaurant is any good, whether I should eat there. Is it cheap? Is it expensive? Is it family dining? Is their dining room open during this period of time? Do you have to wear a mask? Like, it doesn't tell me any of that stuff. So in that regard, the more informed we are about those resources, the better. Having the resource and having the ability to give a phone number is good. Having information about how they move forward or who they need to contact or what the process is even better. Being more informed will help with that. Partnering with the recovery community can be a huge part of this as well. That means knowing what recovery resources are there in your area. That may be things like, again, the mutual aid meetings that we talked about. It may be Faces and Voices of Recovery. Too, there are some groups that are doing things like a sober hike. And so they'll get together and they'll have a hike on a particular trail on a given day or go horseback riding in a particular area as people in recovery. And so what that means is that they're not going to be serving drugs and alcohol on this trip. And it's a chance for people to learn and discover that recovery isn't just about not using. In fact, just focusing on not using will often keep you using. Recovery is about the things you get to do when you're not using. It's about the life that you build apart from the active use. So partnering with the recovery community between recovery and faith communities is incredibly important as well. As the person earlier alluded to, having a guest speaker can be really important as well. Having someone come in and speak can be an important part of that. If you don't have that life story or that lived experience, or you don't have knowledge about addictions and recovery, having someone coming in and speak about it is humility. That's a good thing. That's letting someone else with more information speak into that. Having peers who help can be a tremendous asset. And what that means is there may be people, in fact, if you have a larger faith community, there are probably people in there already who used to struggle, who may be in a place of recovery now. Those people can be invaluable in terms of helping people in their own recovery. And now, not everybody's recovery looks the same way, and it doesn't have to. But having people with lived experience speak into the experience of people who are in that struggle now is incredibly powerful and can make a huge difference. That may be an official certified peer support specialist, but that also may just be somebody who you know is in recovery in your faith community as well. Having those peers can be important. Hosting groups can be a part of that. Many faith communities open up their facilities to hold groups, to host groups, or to have a community meeting, or to have a town hall, or something of that nature around substance use and on recovery. That can be really helpful as well. Meeting those physical needs can make a significant difference. One thing that many faith communities do well is they meet needs in their community, whether that's a food bank, whether that's a clothes closet, whether that's help with transportation, whether that's help filling out job applications. Any of those things, those physical needs, those tangible needs, can be incredibly important. Maybe even some with like heat during the wintertime and things of that nature. That's a place where faith communities really shine and can really serve and minister to the people in their areas and in their faith communities and beyond. Holding those support and mutual aid groups themselves can be a part of that. Again, sometimes the actual faith community will own hosting, not just hosting and providing a facility, but leading, organizing, structuring those. That can be powerful for many as well. Again, it's not a fit for every faith community, every congregation, but it can be a powerful asset. Some faith communities also provide services. They get approved to be providers, or else they do that informally. There are many ministries out there. They're not all created equal. Some do great work. Some are not as effective. And learning what those are can be important. But knowing that faith communities can step in to meet some needs is important. Sort of speaking to that, I see a question over on the side from the chat. So what does pastoral counseling refer to from a treatment perspective? Is there a credential or certification that clergymen, men and women, can get to do pastoral counseling? Again, that depends a lot on your particular faith, your particular denomination. I know individuals who are pastors who also hold licensures and certifications. They're a licensed professional counselor, licensed master social worker, or licensed independent social worker, things of that nature. So those aren't mutually exclusive. There are also pastoral counseling degrees and programs where a person can be approved or credentialed to be a pastoral counselor. That varies a bit by state as well. In my home state, for instance, anybody in the world could put out a shingle that says I'm a pastoral counselor in my home state. That's disconcerting for me, but that's true. It doesn't mean they have any expertise in being pastoral or in counseling, but they can do that in my home state. But state by state, the rules and requirements are a bit different for that. To me, if you're billing, it is important that you are aware of what credentials and things like that are required. But the training piece is needed whether or not someone is billing an insurance company or not. Again, the goal isn't to pull people who are primarily teachers or who are primarily serving in other capacities away from their primary work. I promise you, one thing I find is people in faith communities aren't looking for stuff to do. They have as much as they can handle in most cases. But what it is equipping those individuals to know who to refer to. That may be refer in-house to somebody who's a part of their own faith community, or externally to those services like we were mentioning earlier as well. And along those lines, again, referring when appropriate. That sort of follows up with that full circle. Those are all ways that we can really work to equip our community. Before I jump on and go from there, I want to pause here for a second and ask you in the chat, if you don't mind, what are some things that you can think of that we may have missed, that we may not have included in our list? Like we put out there, here's some ways that you can support recovery. Here are some ways that you can really be effective as a faith community and coming alongside those who are struggling with substance use disorders and with mental health disorders. What are some of those others that we may have missed? Someone said, yes, knowing the resources in your community. Absolutely. Learning what those are. Sometimes that requires something as simple as a Google search. Sometimes it's just talking to somebody. If you have somebody in your faith community you know is in recovery, going, hey, what are the resources? Like if somebody comes to me and they're struggling, what should I do? And listening, see what they tell you. What are some other ones that we may have missed? Other things that may be resources or ways that we can, as faith communities, really support those who are struggling with substance use. Give a second for any others to pop up. Recruiting or consider hiring professional counselors in faith-based settings. Absolutely. I've seen a lot of different models for that. Some people have it may be a pastor of counseling or something like that, a mercy pastor. And again, that's in the Christian faith tradition, but this in other faith traditions as well. Others I've seen actually contract almost like an EAP, where we're basically going to negotiate for a better rate overall with this particular group or this particular counselor who aligns with what we believe or who we believe will do a good job with these individuals. That can be really powerful as well, or just knowing who to refer to. For resources in the virtual world, there are so many AA, NA, Celebrate Recovery meetings. During this season, a lot of those have gone online. So even if transportation is an issue, there are ways to reach out and connect there. Yoga, workouts, etc., that are led by those in recovery. And the warm line is always awesome and easily accessible. Those are all important. Know about resources with technology that can help support people. That can be apps. There are a lot of recovery apps out there, and they range everything from there's some that just send you like a quote of the day that are really basic. There's some that are much more involved that will you can allow it to know your location. And if you put in ahead of time, these are places where I struggle, like this is the bar I always went to, or this is a quote, the dope house I always went to. If you get in proximity of those areas, it will actually text you and go, hey, what are you doing? If you stay in proximity, there's some that will even text your sponsor. That's one of those things like, okay, that's a little different. Housing AA and NA support groups within the church environment. Pastors must have a desire or passion to educate themselves for the maturity of their congregation. I think often you're right. As leaders of faith communities, again, whether that's a pastor, a priest, a rabbi, imam, whatever, a monk, whatever it is that you are serving in, if you are in a leadership capacity in the faith community, there are people who are part of that faith community who are looking to us for guidance, who are looking to us for support. It is important for us to attend things like today to continue to build our knowledge, to continue to build on the resources that we know about, and really to be able to speak with some wisdom about it. And if it is outside of our scope, to speak with wisdom in referring. Having a faith coalition in your area to coordinate resources is one that was mentioned as well. I'm going to scroll up a little bit because I saw one pop up a minute ago and then it scrolled up before I got to see it, and I want to make sure I don't miss it. Partnering with existing organizations. Oh, I couldn't say enough about that one. Again, our goal isn't to reinvent the wheel. If you're in a resource-rich area where there's tons of resources, there's tons of programs, there's tons of services, creating one for the sake of creating it doesn't really make sense. It may just be a matter of knowing those resources and referring. But if you're in the highways and byways, I know I drive all across Kentucky and all across the Carolinas and all across my area, and there are lots of pockets that are just massive tracts of rural areas. Those areas often do not have that degree of resources. So sometimes that may mean connecting through technology with resources. That may mean building some resources, coming together with others in the community and doing that. But what that is building community. And in the end, that's incredibly, incredibly important as well.
Pastors need to be able to identify.
Absolutely. Pastors need to be able to identify. In other words, if someone thinks they're going to be judged when they tell you something, they're less likely to tell you something. It doesn't mean that you have to necessarily have struggled with this yourself, but you have to be able to be compassionate to those who have. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to serve them well. And the truth is that because addiction is so rampant, again, you're talking the 3 to 4 out of 10 walking through your doors are going to be impacted by it. It has likely touched your life in some way, whether through a friend, through a family member, maybe in your own life. It may have touched those, because it's also important to know that that faith leaders are not immune from addiction either. In fact, with the degree of pressure and the degree of demands that are often on them, they are in some ways uniquely susceptible for some people. So it's important to know that as well. Partnering with, uh-oh, it disappeared on me. Pam, will you get that one for me that begins with partnering?
Partnering with your local child protective services to collaborate on family game nights, outdoor excursions, activities, etc., to create opportunities for connection and fun.
Absolutely. One of the things that we didn't go into, because it's beyond the full scope of today's session, is that participation in a faith community is a protective factor related to addiction. It isn't an antidote, it isn't a vaccine that's going to keep you from getting it, but it is a protective factor in terms of having that support network, having that already be there. In that regards, participation in an active faith community is a protective factor. It gives people some alternatives, some pro-social positive ways to engage in things where they're not using substances, and all of those, along with that connection, that interconnection of people, is incredibly important. Also, I see pastors.
Did you also see the one that says the pastors must have a desire or passion to educate themselves for the maturity of their congregation?
Yeah. I
Okay.
think we touched those.
Okay.
And
Then
didn't touch the most recent one. The pastors and church members need to continue to work on being non-judgmental when people come to them about their addictions. This needs to also come from sermons and other ways to help people feel more comfortable. In other words, if the only way they find out whether you're going to judge them or not is if they come to you and say, by the way, I'm struggling with this addiction, the likelihood of them coming to you is greatly diminished. Versus if they hear you articulate that from your place of leadership, and that doesn't have to be like the main service or the main whatever necessarily, but if they hear you are speaking that, it makes them more likely to come to you and be honest with you and transparent with you about what their struggles really are. Now, in terms of beginning to wrap this up, because I know we have about 5 minutes left, and I know we started 2 minutes late, but if I keep you 2 minutes over, my evaluations will suffer, and I know this for sure. I want to end with this thought. Now, I know that there may be people from many different faiths on this particular call, and I'm hopeful that there is. I hope that this is a wide range, and that this is something that we can really carry out through all the different faith communities. But in my own faith tradition and in many others, there is the belief, particularly if you are of a Christian faith, if you are of a Jewish faith, or if you are of the Islamic faith, one of the things that we share in common is a creation story. And the creation story, among other things, includes this idea that basically there was a human being created. The human being lived in the garden. The garden was perfection, and that person had a perfect relationship with God and a perfect environment, and they had never done anything wrong and were, quote, perfect themselves. And into that situation, something not good appeared. And that thing that appeared first that was not good was not anything to do with a snake or a serpent or an apple or anything like that, or a particular kind of fruit. The very first thing in all three of those traditions that was ever called not good came before any of that. The very first thing that was ever considered not good was for a man to dwell alone. We are not designed to do life in isolation. We are designed to do life in community. That's true from a physiological standpoint, whether you're talking about limbic system and mirror neurons and our ability to read the emotions of others and all of those things that are uniquely wired into our physiology. And that is also equally true socially, spiritually, psychologically. We are connected and need to be doing life together. In fact, if you come from other traditions, like if you come from a Buddhist tradition, interdependence is even taking that a step further. That connection is crucial to us in terms of our ability to navigate life and to grow together. We have a word for people in recovery by themselves. we call it high. It doesn't work. There's not recovery in isolation. We recover together. So in that regard, us coming together as faith community and giving people a place where they can belong is so important. I recently heard a gentleman from Tennessee who's a part of the work that they're doing there. He said it this way: first you belong, and then you believe, and then you become. And I thought that was a pretty good way of stating that. People all need a place to belong, and if they can find that within our faith communities, that will be a tremendous win for everyone involved. However, if they cannot find that in our faith communities, they know how to belong at the dope house and at the bar and among friends who are using, whether that's good for them, healthy for them or not, they know. So in that regard, it's so important that we create environments where those that are struggling with substance use and with mental health diagnoses can find a place to belong. So once again, I'm so grateful to you for taking the time today to spend some time with us. There's some great things coming down the pike. If you like today's information, or if you want to learn more about some initiatives and have some additional resources, I will just footnote these. And as I do so, I'm actually going to take a moment to put that link for today's evaluation back in the chat box as well. A few things that are coming up that I want to make sure that you know about. One is that this is part of a webinar series that will actually meet every other month. So we plan webinars again in April and in June. So those are coming down the pike as well. And please watch your inbox. However you learned about this one, hopefully you can find out in the same way. If someone told you about today's webinar and you didn't receive it in your email and you would like to, if you just email the host or the co-host so you don't put your email address to everyone, please do that. For many of you as well, you will receive in your inbox a faith survey that will probably come this week or at the very 1st of March. That faith survey is really asking for input from you as the faith community related to these issues. We're really looking to hear your voice and to build things that'll be helpful to you in serving. So we really ask that you take the time to respond to that. Future listening sessions, we actually have one earlier this month. That's where we take a list of questions and come together as a faith community and as people who are part of faith communities and discuss those. Our next one of those is coming up on March the 25th from 9 to 11 a.m. If you've been to one previously, it is different questions. And so if you've come to one previously, we definitely invite and would love to have your voice back at this one as well. And if you've never attended one, it's a great opportunity to connect. There will also be a model called the Faith and Recovery Community Collaboration Model that will be coming out later on in later spring. We're looking for millennium faith leaders. And what this means is faith leaders who are a little bit younger, up and coming, if you want to call it that. We're really we know there's some differences in how they see the world, how they see the faith community, and we want to engage them deliberately. If you have people who you think may be a good fit for that, please include them in some of this work, include them in some of the emails that you get. You may just forward it to them or encourage them to reach out to myself or to SATTC. There's also an AIR conference, which is specific for faith leaders related to mental health and substance use. That's going to be July 14th to 16th. Save those dates. That's a great conference, and I know would really be a benefit to many. We'll also anticipate a Faith Leadership Academy, which was really just designed around building leadership skills among the faith community and among faith leaders. That'll be, you'll find out more about that later toward fall. It'll be a little bit later before you hear more about that one. There's also some other things that are coming down the pike. I don't want to belabor that. Those are there. I do encourage you to take a look at those. And if there are things you know you're interested in, reach out or keep your eyes open. More information is to come. If you need to reach out or connect with myself in any way, my contact information is there. We want to be a resource. We want to meet the needs that you have. And I'm so grateful to you for taking the time to be a part of today's webinar, to be a part of some of the work that SATTC is doing, but more importantly, to be a part of ministering in your area as a part of your faith community and really reaching out and helping those who are struggling. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for the great and important work that you do. We look forward to finding out more about that, and more information on those faith initiatives are listed in the chat as well. I hope you have a great day. Please do complete the evaluation, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.